Greetings. This is the one you've known as Jesus the Christ. I would like to say a bit about enlightenment, since there's so little understanding about it and so many misunderstandings. Enlightenment, as I'm using this term, refers to the end point of one's evolution on the physical plane, the third dimension. There are no stages of enlightenment. You are either enlightened or not. If you are enlightened, that means this is your last lifetime on the physical plane. You've learned all your lessons and graduated the school you've been attending, and you'll not be required to return. There is no such thing as an enlightenment experience. Enlightenment is not an experience, but a state of completion for the human being. As such, it's nearly impossible for you or anyone else to know whether you or someone else is enlightened, and this is not really for you to know. Unless you're able to assess one's karma, you cannot know whether someone's enlightened or not. You cannot know if they've completed their lessons. Someone may appear enlightened, as you imagine that to be, full of light and free, but if tendencies remain within the human personality to be attached to wealth, power, or some other worldly desire, or if there is any tendency to abuse one's power or act in ways that go against love, that person could not be said to be enlightened. That person has not learned all of his or her lessons. The human personality doesn't have to be perfect, but the soul has to complete all of its lessons. There's a set curriculum each soul must complete before moving on. Since enlightenment is relatively rare, it's best to assume that someone is not enlightened. This doesn't mean that the spiritual teachers you know and respect might not be or become enlightened by the end of their lifetime, but from your vantage point as a human being, this is very difficult to assess, even for a guru or teacher. Many a guru and his or her followers have mistakenly assumed that a guru was enlightened just because he or she is a guru or because he or she says so. However, feeling enlightened and free doesn't necessarily mean one is enlightened. Experiences of great freedom are possible without enlightenment. Many spiritual teachers and others feel very free, so they might assume they're enlightened, or they may have had very profound experiences and assume this. But speaking from our vantage point, we must clarify that one's subjective feeling of freedom is not a measure of one's enlightenment. Unless one's behavior has reached a point where one is no longer creating karma and one has resolved all previous karma, then one is not yet enlightened. And how could you know that, unless you were in touch with those on other dimensions who do know that? To assume that you know this because you're enlightened is circular reasoning and a bit dangerous. The problem we see with many spiritual teachers and gurus is that they feel so free that they assume they must be enlightened, and that therefore whatever they do can no longer create karma. They assume that they are already off the wheel of karma, and that whatever they do is the divine working through them. It often does feel this way, and this can be true to a large extent. But as I've said before, it must never be assumed that the ego is vanquished. That's what the ego would have you believe. If you believe your ego is vanquished, then it can sneak back into the driver's seat, even if only momentarily. One of the ways it does this is through the sense of completion and perfection that many feel as a result of their spiritual progress. I feel so complete. Therefore, I am complete. Therefore, I'm infallible, because there's no I that could make a mistake. Therefore, Whatever I do must be the divine working through me. You can see how dangerous this line of reasoning is once you realize that it's the ego making these assumptions. The ego assumes it's infallible. That this happens should not be surprising. Your spiritual myths have touted the perfection of enlightened beings. Gurus are treated as if they can do no wrong. There's a long tradition of reverence and deference toward gurus and other spiritual teachers, which includes unquestioning obedience to their authority. This blind obedience has not served the guru tradition, as so many gurus have fallen prey to abusing their power, while their followers accept such abuse as part of the teaching. Let me be clear. Abuse of power is not a teaching tool. It's not acceptable behavior in anyone, and certainly not in a spiritual teacher, no matter how true this behavior may seem to the guru. Abuse of power, even low-level abuse, will surely create karma for the guru or spiritual teacher. Gurus are not above creating karma for themselves. In fact, the more power you have, the more harm you can cause, and the more karma you can create. So gurus have often found themselves in a position of having to return to a body in another lifetime and try again to do it right, without abusing their power. Some have had to return many times in the role of guru before they learned the proper use of their spiritual power. To assume that someone is enlightened just because he or she is a guru would be a mistake. Being a guru or spiritual teacher is often not the last lifetime for a soul, since this role offers many of its own lessons, which need to be learned and completed before moving on. The last lifetime for many souls is often a very simple reclusive one, with little of anything that looks like power or fame. Having power or fame is very challenging for human beings, and not necessarily less so for those who are spiritually evolved. Unless a guru or spiritual teacher has experienced power and fame and learned from them in other lifetimes, he or she is likely to have quite a ride the first time around as a spiritual teacher or guru. This helps explain some of what you see in the spiritual marketplace. Enlightenment means that you've completed your lessons on this plane. You've learned what you needed to learn. Karma is the great teacher. If you still have something to learn, then karma will design circumstances that will teach this. Given this, it's safe to assume that those nearing enlightenment are likely to have somewhat easier lives, since they no longer have a need for extraordinary lessons. This doesn't mean that everything goes perfectly for them, however. Those who are nearing enlightenment still have to experience aging, illness, loss, and death, like everyone else. But they'll not face difficulties of their own making, ones created by poor choices, nor are they likely to be put in challenging situations that they didn't consciously choose. They might very well choose to involve themselves in a challenge that's fulfilling and meaningful to them. That's more than likely, as service runs strong in the veins of those who are spiritually advanced. Service to others is a hallmark of those who are spiritually advanced. By their fruits you will know them. This is a good guideline for assessing a spiritual teacher or guru. You can still gain from teachers who are less evolved and still oriented toward getting something for themselves from their role. But generally speaking, look to those who have put the truth above all else and who have your best interests at heart rather than their own. All good teachers exemplify generosity, kindness, patience, humility, and dedication to the truth. It hardly matters how spiritually advanced a teacher is if he or she doesn't have these qualities. Character matters, Character has always mattered in life, and this is no less true after awakening. These qualities are mostly the result of refinement and clearing of the human vehicle of conditioning and egoic habits, and to a lesser extent, the result of spiritual progress. If any of these qualities are absent, then that teacher still has some learning to do. But that's fine. Everyone is traveling their path as best they know how. Everyone is learning and everyone is teaching through their behavior. Even those who abuse their power are teachers for those who need to learn to not accept abuse. However, it bears emphasizing that just because someone can learn from abuse doesn't mean that abuse is a valid teaching device. There is no justification for abuse. There's plenty of abuse available in life for one's lessons from undeveloped souls without the need for a guru to deliver it. Nevertheless, it is good to realize that anything and everything can be learned from. And finally, there are 2 lines of growth occurring in the process leading up to enlightenment, which proceed independently and at their own pace. The first line of growth involves the divine self awakening to itself. It remembers itself through a spiritual process that includes spiritual gifts, spiritual experiences, and altered states of consciousness. The second line of growth involves the completion of the lessons around being human. These 2 processes are not always in sync, and when the spiritual process gets ahead of the human process, the ego can become involved in the spiritual process and disrupt and corrupt it to one extent or another. The human shortcomings and lessons intermingle with the spiritual unfolding in a way that can sully the potential purity of the spiritual process. To lessen the likelihood of this, spiritual traditions have emphasized moral behavior and practices that develop and strengthen one's capacity for behaving more purely, as if one is enlightened, in faking it until you make it. This can result in a phony spirituality, one still dominated by the ego, but an ego that sounds and acts more spiritual. Ah, the traps you can find yourself falling into on the path toward enlightenment. But it is all good, all perfectly designed to teach you and bring you home. All this messiness provides each individual with an entirely unique experience of the spiritual path and makes life interesting. We appreciate your willingness to accept the messiness and mystery of it all and to understand yourselves more deeply. Thank you for being here. We are with you always.